we may not be getting any more people. Paul, do you need to call roll for any purpose, or do you know who's here? Okay. In that case, I'll call the meeting to order. And first of all, like approval of the minutes, unless there's any changes or edits that are necessary for the minutes from the last meeting. If not, I'll take a motion to adopt the minutes. It's been moved and seconded. The minutes of the October 2nd meeting are adopted. For the charges today, I'd like to start with charges 2 and 3, because I think we can get those out of the way in the sense of perhaps getting some input on the language for those, for what Paul has drafted at this point, and then talk about a process to finalize those, probably just by some email exchanges between now and the December meeting, which isn't that far away. So we can kind of get those done. And then, of course, we still have work to do on charge number 1 on outcomes-based funding, and we'll get to that at the end of the meeting. So first of all, on charge number 2, which I think in Paul's document is page 15, is where that starts. He has some draft language there to work from. I think the basic idea is to recommend that we continue on this pathway to get back to the 2011 rate for the INO and the cost of doing so. He's also added some language there that refers to, I believe it was information provided by Lee regarding comparison to peer institutions and the percentage of state funding. And that's really more of just a fact for context, I guess, as much as anything else. But the actual recommendation will be based on enrollment growth plus getting back a step getting back to the 2011 rate. So are there any comments regarding that? If everybody's come with that approach, I think there's still some things with the language here I'd like to see cleaned up a bit, but other than that, the general approach, if everybody's okay with that, we'll go forward with that. Okay, and then Paul, the only thing I'd like is just some clarification here that getting back to the 2011 rate is what we're recommending is kind of as part of a phase-in, which actually the legislature, I guess you could say, started this past session. This would be the next step in getting back to that. And then I'd also like it clear what the totals are. In terms of reading here, it's not real clear to me anyway that what the total amount of funding we are recommending. And I can send you some language on that if you like. I think that was the only comments that I had. Is there anything else, any other instructions we want to give Paul? What he'll do is he'll clean up some of the language, then send that out to everybody for an okay, so you'll have another opportunity to make any additional changes you think are necessary, unless you have something now. Yeah, Ed.
Along the lines of what you're trying to clarify, but I mean the overall move would cost $985 million, right? So is it about a third? Is that what each? Because you're talking about doing that over a 3-year period, so it's.
So what I did was I took a third of the difference between the rate that you just got appropriated and the rates that you were originally appropriated in 2010 and 11. The $985 million is actually the amount that it would take to get to the same percent of state funding as your peer institutions in other states. But I think what John's asking for is what that total number would be to return us back to the 10-11 rates, and I'll put that in there.
Right, and just make it clear in here what the recommendation is for 16 and 17.
Okay.
The total number, not just the INO and the ENG together. And I think Ed's point is kind of the same thing I had in terms of just clarifying this. That initial paragraph you have regarding the peer institutions, let's move that down below the specific INO and ENG recommendations. Again, just as a matter of context, since that's not the actual recommendation we're making, I don't want that to be the first paragraph.
Okay.
So I think once this is redrafted, hopefully it'll be clear to everybody what the specific recommendation for 16 and 17 is, sort of what the strategy behind that is in terms of phasing back to the 2011 level, and then just this sort of contextual fact of where we stand with peer institutions. Any other comments or questions? Okay. Then on charge number 3, on page 18, Paul has drafted some language here based upon our discussion last time. Does anybody have any comments regarding that language? We will go ahead, Perry.
At some point in the discussion of this, it was recommended that the cost include counseling and some other things that perhaps were not directly related to instruction.
In terms of the
Competency-based.
Yes.
So when we do,
what I would envision is that in that third paragraph where we're asking A&M Commerce to provide us additional information, I would assume they would provide that type of data to us.
Okay.
If that's what's involved, then yes, those costs should be reported back to us. Then in the future, we'll make a decision whether how to compensate for those type of costs. But okay, Paul.
So I'm sorry. Are you looking for the language to be changed here to be that specific, or are you just looking for me to make sure that when we collect the costs that we include all their overhead costs as well as any direct costs?
I would prefer not to see somebody figure out a cost, but to have it broken down as fairly detailed as possible. Because I wouldn't want us to see us including a cost in this area that we don't include as a cost in the regular courses.
Okay.
Well, I'm not saying no to it. I'd just like to see it. That's all.
And based on the discussion we had last time, I think because of those kind of things, we had talked about that competency-based education we may need a separate formula just because of those kinds of issues. But yes, I would assume those would be reported back as part of A&M Commerce cost to the extent that applies. So we'll do this one the same way. Paul will, if there's any additional changes to it, we'll get that out to you, and again, ask for your approval of final language once we have everybody's input on this chart.
John, this is Cindy, the UT El Paso. I
Yes,
have a
Cindy, go
question.
ahead.
I wasn't at the last meeting, so perhaps it's because I wasn't there, but the first paragraph, is that just intended to explain how these courses should be handled in the cost study? And then the second paragraph, how it should be handled in the formula?
I believe let's see. I think the first two paragraphs are to clarify that we're not recommending a change in terms of how we're currently doing it. We are recommending that more data needs to be collected on this before we can make a funding decision. So we would not anticipate that to happen until the next Forum Advisory Committee during the next interim. Does that answer your question, Cindy?
Not entirely, but you know what? That's okay. I can catch up with Paul and try to make up the ground since I missed the last meeting. That's okay.
Okay, and again, this is a case where if we need to clarify anything in this language, we'll have an opportunity to do that. So.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, then, if everybody's all right with proceeding to charge number 1. Trey Miller is back with us, and he's had an opportunity to review what we did last time in the context of how he's viewed these things nationally. And have you had a chance to look at the new models that Paul sent out?
I have not seen the new models. I've seen last year's proposal.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, Trey, why don't you go ahead and
Sure.
report?
Well, and here's the clicker. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and for everyone's input on the questions that I formulated here to address. I worked with some colleagues at RAND to conduct an objective and neutral assessment of last year's formula funding proposal. So this is what we've kind of arrived at as the charge for my work here. In particular, what I did is I drew on kind of a vast literature that's emerging on best practices in performance funding. This performance funding has been around for quite a while, and there's a large experience to draw on, and there's increasingly these lists of best practices that have come out, people reviewing what's gone on, and in particular, I drew on 7 different studies that tried to distill that research on best practice into a set of best practices. I then looked at and examined last year's proposal. I looked at documents that describe the proposal in detail and talked with a number of folks in the room about to kind of nail that down. And then I related the last year's proposal to these best practices, identified where there are strengths, and in general we found that there were, and identified where there were some gaps and proposed some considerations for moving forward. So it's important for me to say that the work here benefited from everyone in the room. And I took input from committee members and from folks from the coordinating board, but the work was neither vetted nor endorsed by either party. So I'm trying to be a neutral, unbiased observer here. So what did we find? In general, we found that last year's proposal was quite good when compared to what's considered best practices in performance funding. And I'll talk about the particular best practices that the proposal is particularly aligned with here. I was particularly, I think one of the strongest points of the proposal is that it drew from a very collaborative process amongst everyone here in the room, the committee, the institutions, the coordinating board, a number of different stakeholders. You came to the table, agreed on goals for higher education in Texas, and defined a set of metrics that you could agree on to do as best as possible at measuring those outcomes. And so I think in general this is considered a very important part of the process for developing an effective and long-lasting, sustainable performance funding system, because you really have to have everyone's buy-in to get it to last. So another best practice that we identified is that the funding formula should be simple and difficult to game. So there's a balance here between being simple and difficult to game, but you have to make the metrics such that they're understandable to all parties, and institutions know how to address them and how to improve their performance on those metrics. At the same time, it's difficult to game. And by and large, the performance funding system proposal made last year kind of meets this best practice. All of the metrics most of them are based on numbers of graduates and weighted in ways to account for a number of different considerations. There's other metrics to award completion and other factors, but they are all quite understandable. Another best practice that we identified is to focus on completion, graduates, but reward progress and success. So towards those metrics or towards completion. This is because a lot of institutions are at different stages, and some may not. There are a lot of institutions that are. Will need to improve performance in ways beyond completion and show progress towards completing large numbers of students. And there's a metric in the system to reward completion or progress. I
think they're working on the sound.
They're working on it, so we don't get feedback, and they may have worked on it too.
Okay.
Go ahead and speak up. We'll try and.
Okay. So another metric or another best practice that we identified in the literature was to reward degree production in critical fields. The metric or the last year's funding model proposal includes a metric to reward degree production in critical fields. I think moving forward, there will need to be a way to update those critical fields, and so I think that's something that the committee should consider thinking about for future is how to update those critical fields. Should also keep implementation costs down. So the performance funding, the model from last year, all of the metrics are based on data that is already collected by the coordinating board. So there's no additional data collection. I think that's key. If we're recommending additional data collection, that comes at a huge cost to the institutions, and there's a lot that we're already collecting. So these are all factors that are key to successful implementation and impact, and particularly sustainability, and the proposal embodied these best practices. That said, there may be room for improvement on 4 particular best practices, and they're listed here. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on each, so I just list them here for reference. So first, the current at-risk metric, I think there was reference to the at-risk metric perhaps needing to be revised in the actual recommendation to the coordinating board last year. But it draws on a number of different characteristics of students and identifies 65% of college students as at risk of not dropping out. So this may very well be true, but just in terms of the analytics, if you are identifying 65% of college students as at risk and you're trying to reward institutions for taking on and educating students that are at risk of dropping out, you start to lose the power to do that. Simply because the more students that you identify as at risk with this metric, the more that metric just starts to look like total number of graduates and loses its flavor of being at risk or adequately, defining who is at risk. So I would, recommend considering looking further at this at-risk metric and working together to develop a metric that better delineates those students. So another issue that I think we talked about when I was here last time was differentiating institutions by mission. So one of the issues that a lot of institutions and other stakeholders have kind of voiced in performance funding systems is that they don't mind being held accountable, but they want to be held accountable for what their mission is and what their goals are as an organization and institution. And the current or last year's proposal includes a mission factor, but it's hard to really say how that's related to the institution's actual mission. A number of other states have experimented with other ways of incorporating institution mission into performance funding systems, and one that's been, I think, most popular is differentiating some metrics by peer groups or Carnegie classification. And even some states define particular sets of metrics that apply within particular peer groups and have different weighting for different on those metrics for different peer groups. And that's particularly common and is in Tennessee and some other states. Another approach that Pennsylvania has experimented with and has in their policy is they actually have an institution-specific metric that the institutions define their some part of their mission that they would like to improve, and then they work with their governing body and set that metric and incorporate that metric into their funding system. So another issue is accounting for student characteristics, and this has a similar flavor to the at-risk and mission. A lot of institutions and other stakeholders will say, we just have different students, and it's unfair to compare, say, a regional institution that takes lots of, that enrolls lots of students that may have different needs to a flagship, for example, on metrics like raw graduation rates or numbers of graduates. So there's a number of ways that this has been taken into account in different funding systems. I actually worked out, and I include in the appendix a metric that I would say is worth consideration. I call it the student-weighted graduates. And so this metric, I can go into more detail later, but basically what it does is it weights graduates according to this overall state distribution of student attributes. And I can show how it does that. It does that with simple means and weighted means. And I think is a transparent way of doing this. So I'll put that up as something to consider. But I think just grouping institutions by mission and improving the at-risk metric also gets at these issues, and so just doing that in an appropriate way could move this forward quite a bit. Finally, there's kind of the best practice in the literature in terms of funding for performance metrics or performance funding is, says it's a balancing act. You have to balance, you have to ensure that there's enough funding to create, cause for making changes, but you also don't want to create unstable funding system and funding flows for institutions. And so you want to balance between those two factors. But what has been identified as best practices across all of these studies is somewhere between 5 and 25% of total funding for higher education, state funding for higher education. The current proposal is at 5.2% of total funding. It's 10% of undergraduate semester credit hours, but it's when you run the calculations, it's at 5.2% of total state funding. So it's at the very bottom of that range, and it may be worth considering increasing the amount or percentage. Finally, I just wanted to address a stream of literature that I think is particularly relevant at this stage and for kind of moving forward. So Kevin Doherty at Community College Research Center and Columbia University has done quite a bit of work, and I drew heavily on his work for the best practices, but he also has done a lot of work looking at what performance funding systems have done well and which ones have been sustainable, which ones have kind of gone by the wayside in various states. And he has some lessons for sustainability that I think are particularly relevant. It turns out, so I'll list them here. I think one of the biggest issue that he identifies is that performance funding tends to be the first thing to go when things go wrong in terms of funding or the political situation. If whomever is the kind of political catalyst for getting the funding model passed goes, then in some states that's what leads to its demise once it's implemented. In other states, it's that funding goes down and the state budget situation declines, and so performance funding gets dropped at that stage. And this has happened in a lot of states. And so some people point, and a lot of folks have pointed at these kind of performance funding models that have ended in some states as evidence that they're not working. But I think it's more about creating a situation where they're sustainable and able to continue through these kinds of difficult times. And so Kevin Doherty lists some best practices from a number of states, particularly Tennessee, that has led to longer-term models. So first, you have to institute a collaborative process for updating the model. So if you just if it happens on a yearly basis, new metrics get added, new weighting get applied every year, then the funding stream becomes unstable, and institutions don't like that. All right, and so if you have a longer-term perspective in making updates to the model, that has been more effective at creating a long-term stability. Also, I talked about finding ways to insulate the model from swings in the state budget and the political process. That's really key. And finally, obtaining buy-in from stakeholders outside of the political process in higher education is another kind of way to instill stability. So Kevin particularly talks about getting the business community's buy-in for performance funding. Anyway, I think that's the key points I wanted to make and offer up for consideration to the committee. I have some additional slides that on the particular metric, the student-weighted graduate or characteristic-weighted graduates, that I could go through if there's interest, but I only want to do that if there's interest. So.
Okay, thanks, Trey.
Sure.
Any questions or anything here in Trey's presentation? Sure.
Is it working now? Oh, okay. Sorry. Can you give a little explanation about how it is, I guess, across the country, we've historically arrived at these metrics as the ones that really provide us any relevant information with regard to performance-based funding, because I expect most people would think that the place that you began is with learning outcomes rather than critical fields or at risk and things of that nature, because this doesn't say anything about learning. And so is this a matter of convenience politically? Is that how we arrived at this kind of a set versus something that's more based in pedagogy?
So the learning outcomes, there are some states that have experimented with learning outcomes and using things like the CLA and various ways to assess student learning. And the evidence is really mixed on whether that has been effective. And I think, at least looking at the literature on what, I think some institutions expressed a lot of displeasure with the particular types of assessments that were used there and felt that students weren't being assessed on what they thought they should be assessed on. So it opens up a can of worms in terms of what assessments do you use, what do you measure, particularly when you get into, fields like engineering and fields where there's, content or discipline-specific content. Do you measure that? How do you place institutions that have a larger emphasis on technical fields on an equal footing with those that emphasize the liberal arts? It's hard to align all of the institutions, all the various stakeholders behind a particular set of metrics that is defined by student learning, I think, is what has really led to that not being used very often across the states. So,
then I guess the second question then that comes out of that is, do we have some robust data that in fact implies that these are measuring the kinds of things that we want to measure?
The number of graduates?
The mix that we have. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's primarily based on number of graduates.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's certainly, I think, true that, institutions want to graduate their students. And so this is, I think, why this particular metric and variance of numbers of graduates have gotten traction is because everyone at the table can agree that we all want to graduate our students. Everyone at the table can agree that we all want to move them towards progress, towards the degrees and completion. We all want to have our institutions support their own missions, and we all want the system to be fair. And I think that's what's led to systems of metrics that are akin with what's in last year's proposal and some of the additional considerations that I've offered up. Whether or not they are the best metrics in terms of measuring the actual performance of institutions, I think that's a separate. That's another question. But once you get into that, it opens up another can of worms in terms of aligning institutions again. So I think it's a balancing act to get a set of metrics that everyone at the table can agree upon and measure outcomes that everyone thinks the institution should be achieving.
And maybe the other way to ask that question is, do we have good data to suggest that these metrics really do serve as good surrogates for the learning part of what we're looking for? I mean, I would assume that we should believe that, but do we have some kind of, I guess, reliable information that really is telling us that?
So in terms of student learning, does graduation measure that? Does completion of degrees measure that? Is that your question?
Well, we would hope it would, but there's a big leap from learning whatever it might be in electrical engineering versus criminal justice versus nursing.
Right.
And so that, I guess I'm just wondering how it is that those pieces have been put together to get us to something that across the country we really believe there's a reliability there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that, this is an active area of research, right, in terms of how do you measure student learning or institution performance beyond, with metrics other than test scores, and how are they, correlated. So I think the kind of research base isn't up to the policy agenda at this point to really support, but we're at a stage where, policy needs to be made, so you have to make some, difficult calls. I think that's really the space we're in at this point. So.
Ed?
So, just to follow up on that, I mean, it seems to me that what we're talking about is moving from a public policy that had focused on access to one that is moving in the direction of giving some emphasis to success. And so it is really degrees that is the center of this policy change. So I mean, I think that is that a fair statement? I mean, sometimes we're not as clear about that, and that because there is all this discussion about learning outcomes and all that, but this doesn't seem to have anything to do with that. This is just moving towards, and our faculties often say, you move in that direction, of course, you're going to dumb it down. I mean, you're going to dumb, because if you're going to start rewarding us for degrees instead of seats, people in seats, you're running a risk on that kind of a policy. But that being the case, I guess my issue going to, the 4 areas that you are drawing our attention to, the at-risk students, the mission, the student characteristics, and the funding piece, the recommendations you're making is some sort of weighting system that would be differentiated from the model that was proposed in the last session.
So, yes, I think that is one way to get at mission and student characteristics. And so particularly, so I think there's two issues. One is mission. And so one way that this has played out in a number of states is differentiating and defining peer groups with where institutions have similar missions. So it's around kind of defining what institutions have similar missions, and then comparing institutions within those groups according to sometimes even different metrics, or at least weighting the metrics in ways that account for their mission in certain ways.
Can I just interrupt, just saying, to relate this to degrees? So does this translate, roughly speaking, to, first of all, the type of student that's coming in? Because a big predictor of graduates is going to be the inputs,
right?
Which you make very clear in your presentation, that there is a big differentiation between socioeconomic and preparedness groups that are high in capability to those that are not prepared and not socioeconomically prepared to support themselves going in. So that's one set of variables. The other set of variables that is major is the mixture of native students and transfer students in an institution. I mean, so when we talk about mission, it really, and at-risk students, it really boils down to that third group of student characteristics, because we're talking about graduations, and we're talking about graduations relative to the characteristics of the students. Wouldn't that simplify kind of what we're doing?
Well, I think that's close. I think so. I think mission is a kind of a broader term than just the student characteristics. So there may be various activities that institutions, a particular institution may endeavor in, or we want to be the best at this particular program, at engineering. We want to improve ourselves in this program, and we see ourselves as an engineering institution. This is just for sake of example. And institutions ought to have, according to many in this space, institutions ought to have the right to differentiate themselves in different ways and seek to improve themselves on their core mission. They need to define their mission, but they should be able to differentiate themselves in this way. So I think it gets beyond just student characteristics and into what are the key activities of a particular institution. And that's, it gets difficult in grouping peer institutions in this way, and I think that's why Pennsylvania landed on this kind of institution-specific metric approach, where each institution, I think there's a lot of work in doing this, and there's a lot of back and forth, so it creates a lot of additional work. But what they did was each institution said, "Hey, this is something that we want to do to differentiate ourselves, and we want to improve ourselves on this particular thing, and we're going to hold ourselves accountable on this particular metric." So institutions propose their metric and go in kind of a process with the governing agency to define that and incorporate it into their system. Now, student characteristics explicitly, I've also offered up this student-weighted graduates metric that is it's more flexible, I think, than just grouping by Carnegie classification and having some way to account for at-risk students, and that it basically looks at graduation rates within kind of cells defined by particular student characteristics, and then it looks at the statewide distribution of students within those cells defined by those characteristics. And so what it does is it gives you a weighted average of the graduation rate, where it's weighted so that this would be the graduation rate of this institution if it had the same graduation rate within these cells but had the statewide distribution across those cells, right? And so that's really what it does. And it does that just by weighting means according to the statewide distribution of students with various attributes. And then it gets back to number of graduates by multiplying that graduation rate by the cohort size on which it was calculated. So that's one way to build in other kinds of factors like you're talking about beyond just at risk. You could build in SAT score or various measures of incoming characteristics of students and what kind of initial preparation they have. But
where has that been used? That's
something I just proposed. I've done a lot of work on measuring performance, and I participated in a Gates Foundation project called Context for Success, where drew a number of different researchers together to think about how best to measure student performance, institutional performance with administrative data that's common across states. And so I can I wrote a report on this that actually used Texas data to develop some metrics. The methodology there didn't pass the test, I think, of being clear and being very, transparent, right? So I tried to unpack in this, kind of proposed metric. I tried to unpack what I was doing with that input-adjusted outcome metric that I developed for the Gates Foundation into a, set of means so that it's, I think, more transparent to institutions and other stakeholders, and is not just, some sophisticated, statistical model. So.
Have we tried to model this at all, Paul?
No, we haven't modeled it yet.
So is that a reasonable thing for us to do, is to see what that would look like and whether or not we think it meets some of those other tests that they had talked about?
We can look at it depending on how much time y'all want to spend, but we can model most of it. I mean, I don't know that we have every single one of the or data elements that was required.
I made sure that the data elements that this particular version drew on were data elements that are in the coordinating board's data system.
We can model it.
So.
In that case.
And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it would seem to me that the primary benefit of that is that it really provides you a level of precision on the mission piece of this that we may not have now because of the large lumping, essentially, that is taking place. And there's not a lot of distinction between the 38 universities or so that are in here with regard to mission. They're very, very, very broad categories right now. Is that a fair statement?
I think it provides you more precision and ways to account for student characteristics, incoming characteristics of students. I'd agree on, and it's not. It doesn't have to just be SAT and Pell eligibility, which I used as example. Characteristics. I mean, I think it's about choosing the characteristics that you want, that you feel as, stakeholders in this, that are, important to consider when making comparisons of, numbers of graduates, of students. Which of these characteristics would make it more fair, right? That's so.
In the universe of student characteristics, do you consider the at-risk metric to be a subset of that?
So yes, and in fact, the metric that I used, one of the metrics that I used in the example was Pell eligibility, which is basically part of, it's incorporated in the at-risk metric, the current at-risk metric.
So in the work of the previous Formative Advisory Committee, these kind of things were discussed. The at-risk metric was the one metric that we did have a consensus that it made sense to have something along those lines. Other student characteristic metrics that we could use, I think the difficulty is that the universe of those metrics is almost unlimited because every student is unique. So and I think if you look at the public ed system as an example where student characteristics is very much a part of the funding formula, it becomes a question of where do you draw the line as to what characteristics are appropriate and which ones aren't. What they do is they make the formula more complicated. Mm-hmm. And that's assuming you have the data on whatever metric you're seeking, so forth. So, we can go down that road, but again, the last committee looked at it and just felt like the complications of it alone were difficult, and that we wanted to try to get at risk right because that was the one that we had a consensus around, and I think it's it's fair to say we may not have it right yet. It may still need to be tightened up in some way. But once we do that, then, and we have some history with it in the funding formula, then other student characteristics may be appropriate. And I think that's essentially the way the public ed formula has evolved over time, is that other student characteristics have been added over time as there is some consensus developed around the idea. So we can certainly model what Trey's developed here. I don't know that, what that's going to add. I mean, it will shift some numbers around, I suppose, in the formula, and then we can look at that. But is it really a metric that we can easily explain and sell to the legislature, I guess, is the question. Yes.
Just one question about the last proposal. The weighting of the at-risk was less than 1, was it? I mean, I read somewhere that it was like point.
It was 1.
It was 1.
Now, I think Paul had, in his model, he has some information there with a different weight, and when we come to those models later, he'll explain what he did there. Okay. The other comments I had on first of all, on the issue of missions, we do have some models that Paul has done along those lines. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. On the funding issue, how many states currently have more than 5% of their funding committed to outcomes-based funding?
That's actually growing in what they're calling it's been termed in the research literature the PBF 2.0, performance-based funding 2.0 models, which really based on the history that if you don't put enough funding into the performance funding system, it's something that's probably not going to be sustainable and is going to, I think there was a history in Texas of this happening with past performance funding models being dropped because of reductions in the state budget. And so there's been a shift where if we're going to do it, we're going to do it where it is sustainable. And so I'm not sure the actual numbers, but it's in this what they're calling PBF 2.0. And I think Tennessee is an example of their new model, which builds off their past model, is considered a PBF 2.0, where it's, it's an outcomes-based funding model within the general funding model. So,
well, go ahead, Perry.
But the average across all states is less than 5%.
That's true. Yes.
Considerably less, I suspect, than 5%.
And my recollection of the survey that the staff did after the first meeting, obviously Tennessee is more than 5%. Maybe Ohio was more than 5%, but I don't recall any other state that was over 5%. Mm-hmm. And the point is just that this is still very much experimental. Everybody's trying to figure it out. So for us to come in with a proposal that's about 5%, sounds like a reasonable place to start until we know that we've got this right and can develop a consensus around it. But
could I ask one other question? I just want to be clear on the charge. Did the last legislature ask us to do this, or the one before? The last legislature turned down what we sent over.
It was in the one before. It's in statute, HB 9 from the 82nd legislature.
Okay.
Put it in statute that our recommendation will include.
But the most recent legislature turned down what we sent over.
Yes.
Okay. I'll have more to come back to this later.
Okay. There's no other questions for Trey then. I'd like to move on to the information that Paul sent to us regarding charge number 1. So, Paul, why don't you just walk through this, and I know there'll be some questions. There's been some confusion over some of it, so.
Okay. All right. So what I did was I put together basically 5 runs, one of them being what they turned down. Is that number 1? That's number 1. Let's see here. And so I'm working off page 12 now. Page 11 is basically just a comparison of option number 1, and I compared it both to the overall I&O and the undergraduate I&O. Page 12 gives you the first new version, option number 2. What we did there was we took option number 1, and the first step was, instead of weighting the different metrics, we scaled them. And really, it's not any different. The idea there is to get them mathematically comparable. What that took to match up to Tennessee's model was to make one metric 50 and put at risk at 0.4. And at risk is at 0.4 because that's what Tennessee gave it. I just wanted to make it as comparable as a starting point as possible. That's what they gave in additional to the degree. So if you had an at-risk student graduate, you got the degree, and then you got 0.4 more for that particular at-risk student. Once we scaled everything, then we went to the weights. And so option number 2 takes and applies a set of weights for each accountability group. So where before we had the same weights for every institution, now we have a different set of weights for each institution. And to roll back to page 10, I show you what those look like for each accountability group. You can see research has total undergraduate degrees at 20%, the adjusted by 6-year graduation rate at 25, the per 100 at 25, and so on across the different measures. But then you can see for emerging research, it's a little bit different. It's not quite the same. Now, because we're taking this outside of the formula, it's not just modifying the undergraduate formula funding, it's modifying whatever funding might have gone into the formula. I went ahead and did another version with graduate degrees in it. And on page 10, you can see what I did for the weights for that. And then back on page 12, option number 3 is just like option number 2. All I did was slid in graduate degrees to show how that would affect things.
Let me ask, were graduate degrees considered in the one we had last?
No.
Why are we considering undergraduate? Graduate degrees are uneven. When the whole point of outcome is always undergraduate.
We're not considering it. I just offered it up here so that you'd have it to talk about. You can ignore it if you don't want to consider it.
One of the things is we were trying to look at Tennessee's model at the same time. They include research dollars in graduate degrees. It is.
And as I said the first time we did this and talked about this, if you go back to that report, most states haven't done this. I mean, it isn't an avalanche of states moving forward on this. And the most recent indication we have from our legislature is they're not too interested. So, I mean,
I still have statute.
I guess I'm a little perplexed as to how we are where we are. I would like to have more indication that the legislature is truly interested in it and know why they turned down what we sent before. I suspect they turned it down because some gained too much and there were too many losers. Where we're going to, just from a practical political perspective, we probably need to get to a point where we have, be quite honest about it, the fewest losers, which probably means also the fewest winners, so that it is a politically acceptable. I hate to jump to this, get into the intricacies, detailed intricacies of all these different models and get confused, particularly whether we include graduates. Whole point, it seems to me, whenever I've done with these complete College America or business association meetings on this, always getting back to performance at the undergraduate level, the graduation rates.
And I will say last time we worked very hard to minimize the shifting of funds. And we got it down to less than 1% or maybe 1% up or down either way, I believe. And now I'm using my memory.
It's in that chart on page 11.
You look at all the models too, probably not with one. Compromised by only looking at the graduate budget. Comes to
That affects the greatest number of these. You probably modify that by saying no more than $1 million up or $1 million down. In fact, that would come the closest to passing.
And that is the model we recommended last time.
Yes, with undergraduate, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
I think in Paul's piece, I think he's trying to speak to that, where that the funding by institution would not vary more than 0.5% in the first year and no more than 1% in the third year. Is that right?
Right. The language that we haven't gotten to yet in the draft report has not only this, what we're talking about right now, but also has a phase-in that limits the amount of change as a percentage.
Families, we always say 3 years we get here. If we adopt it. So, I mean, that leases me a little bit, but it doesn't.
So to wrap up, options number 4 and 5 are similar to 2 and 3, except instead of using the accountability peer groups, I used the Carnegie classification to group the institutions. And you can see it does have an effect.
Yes.
Any more comments, questions?
Yeah, the question and why the shift in Carnegie, is the Carnegie versus the accountability group, is that because the Carnegie is more, breaks down more? Or?
I think the biggest impact was that with the Carnegie, you have more institutions in the top tier. With the peer groups, we just have the 2 institutions in the very top tier. But with Carnegie, I think you have 5 or 6 of the emerging research come up into group number 1. And that's what causes the shift, because they're using the salary, the faculty salary. The part of the model that I haven't talked about that Tennessee also included was once they get done weighting all their points, then they take the Carnegie average faculty salary for the nation and they monetize the model based on that, and then they fund a percent of that. So that feature right there is what skews the two. I use the Carnegie average, the national average salaries in all of these options here. Any other questions?
Comments regarding these? Actually, I think the decision points here are pretty limited. It's, first of all, there's the fundamental question of including graduate hours and graduate degrees. The question if you're doing something mission specific, do you use the accountability group, do you use the Carnegie classification? And beyond that, there's really not much. I mean, depending on which way you go on those questions, there are other possible decision points, obviously. I mean, my first thought is that with regard to the Carnegie classification, since we have our own accountability groups specific to Texas, to introduce them as a mission measure would probably not be productive in the legislature. They're not accustomed to looking at them. They probably don't care what they are. So I think I just don't think that's going to help us any. Now, doing something by accountability groups makes more sense to the extent that we want to do something with mission. And I will say that based on the conversations that did take place during the session, that was a fairly common question about this. This formula doesn't take into account mission or something to that effect, even though you could argue that there are specific metrics within our formula that do that indirectly, but.
Well, and this is just repeating, I think, what we've already said a number of times, but if all we do is to make some modifications off of one, I think we've got to find in some way to address those 2 primary issues, which were the 2 primary issues with the legislature. Number 1 was the redistribution of funds, and I don't see any way to do this without redistribution of funds, so maybe we just need better reasons why we're doing it and clarification of why and how we're doing it. And the other major one was the concern about one size fits all, and wanting to see mission-specific applications in this. And while I love Trey, I've looked at those concepts for success. I love what they attempted to do in there, especially where they said if you have this input of students, you have students coming into you with these qualifications, what should you expect to receive? And are you meeting or exceeding your expectation? It'd be wonderful if we could do that, but it's very complex, as we've already said, and the data gets a little fuzzy, and I've looked through some of those papers that were written. So it seems to me somehow or another we've got to try to come back to how close do we want to stay with the original, and can we work into the original these two issues, these other two issues that we know the legislature brought up the first time and will very likely bring up again if we haven't at least tried to address them.
Draft recommendation, the one that is the draft. The 234 million that's to be added. Let me ask it this way. Are we saying that charge 2 must be funded before this charge?
I think that's a decision for the committee to make.
I feel much better if that's what we actually said. In other words, that we're going to fully fund the basic before recommendation before we.
Well, we obviously on charge number 2, we've kind of come to consensus on what that recommendation is. So the only question is, do we add the language that says this should be funded first? And I want to say last time we had language like that, maybe.
Maybe. But we could certainly add a sentence in this charge to say that the INO needs to be funded at recommendation, or the formulas need to be funded at recommendation before money goes to this.
I guess what I may be thinking is that in the legislature, when performance-based funding was discussed, that there were many legislators that viewed it that way. Let's fund this first. Of course, that was an unknown number at the time, what we'd actually go into INO, but that performance-based funding would be a separate decision after that. But we can certainly include that sort of language if that's what we want to do. Okay. Is there agreement to go ahead and do that, or do you want to talk about that?
It's not me.
Have you gotten to that point, Paul?
Pretty close.
If people want to think about what Perry's just proposed, and we can obviously do it as part of our draft, or if you feel strongly enough about it, we can go ahead and make a motion and vote on that, adding that at this point in time. But
I want to make sure I'm understanding that we're saying that we want the formula itself to be funded as it is now, and that outcomes-based be a separate pool that is allocated separately.
That's correct.
At $234 million is our recommendation.
Right, and that's 5% of the INO formula. Perry?
I want to make sure that I understand it. In other words, if we didn't fully fund charge 2, if they didn't provide what was recommended, perhaps, they give you 80. I don't know the numbers on this because we don't have that yet, but they did not fully fund charge 2, but said, here's $234 million over here. In one sense, that's not additional money. That's the way we're conceiving of the performance outcomes, is that you have new money in addition to the other money. But if the other money has not been provided, then it's not additional money. All I'm saying is, to make that point even stronger, is that that charge 2 be fully funded before this charge is funded.
Well, on the one hand, we don't control it. We can make the recommendation. I think the concern or the question I would have, the recommendation that we're making on the current INO formula is it's not a huge increase, but it's a fairly significant increase in the history of how the formula has been funded. So it's a reasonable goal, but a high goal for the legislature to meet. Obviously, the commissioner is expecting or hoping that with whatever we recommend, that institutions will go into the next session and be supportive of whatever it is we finally decide. So the question is, if the legislature only funds 2/3 of whatever that amount is, does that mean everybody jumps ship on performance-based funding? Again, knowing that that may not make any difference, the legislature will do whatever the legislature is going to do, but certainly, if I were a commissioner, that would be one of the questions I would have.
Do we have any sense of the amount of money involved in the charge 2? The total amount.
It is in the
additional funds.
I just haven't added it up. Let me do some math.
I would like to see it in reference to
I want to say it's somewhere around
234.
$300 million, but it may actually turn out to be a little bit less than that.
Paul, I think we've been relatively consistent. I know certainly across the A&M system saying that our first priority is always to fully fund the formula.
Right.
And so I think what is being suggested would be very, very consistent with what we've been saying for the last couple of sessions. I don't see that as a problem at all. I'd be fully supportive of the recommendation. And it would be perfectly consistent with what we've been saying for years now.
No, I understand. I agree with that. I agree. Ed?
While he's adding that up, I think one of the questions with regards to the universities around the state supporting this is the answer to point 2, that do they understand what we're proposing in terms of one size doesn't fit all? I mean, what is it, how are we going to negotiate, the different sizes so that the universities clearly understand that this is in their interest to support this? I think that's the tough part of even what Paul's put together, because there's a suggestion that there would be some going back and forth with the individual institutions, so that there would be, I think one issue that was raised last time with regards to the faculty, to the formula committee, was to what extent did they go back, to their universities and win the support in the universities for the proposal. And the sense was that because there wasn't this kind of back and forth discussion about how does it modify to the mission of my particular institution, they didn't own that going into the session.
Well, and I think all of us are in the same boat on that. Ultimately, that's a decision of the chancellor, the presidents, and the board as to what their buy-in level is. Now, there could have been better explanations going on or whatever, but that's an issue for what happens after we finish our recommendations, obviously. On the issue of one size fits all, clearly if we do something by accountability group, then that is something we can point to as addressing that issue. Will be simple to understand. Without that, I think you can get there with the existing metrics, but it does require more work. It is more difficult to explain using the existing metrics.
So we'd wind up funding $4.67 billion. That's the level that you're looking for. What's the increase? Well, didn't ask me to add that up. I'm not a computer.
Oh, come on.
Gosh.
I think the increase is around $300 million is my
I think it is about
recollection, but
So the increase is around 300 million, but and we're saying 234 million in this charge.
And the two combined are not outside the realm of possibilities, in a good session, certainly. But, of course, there's funding for health-related, there's funding for community colleges that are for Texas grants, all these other things get factored in as well. So I think we're, depending on what the session looks like, there are things that are doable. They're high bars.
Especially if you are fortunate enough to put it in the context of what Lee Holcomb brought us, that really we're down $1 billion just in comparison to the other states, and Texas is supposed to be doing better than other states. So, I know that that's a very difficult sell because, well, we have borders. They don't care about the other states, but it's still a lower number.
Well, let me suggest this, at least on your point, Perry, that in what gets circulated, we can add language to that effect, get comments back from everybody, and if that's where everybody wants to go, or at least the broad consensus want to go, then we'll certainly include that language.
John, I think one thing we better be prepared to accept is the language is fine. I'm sure probably all of us agree with it, but there is no prediction of how it will be done, of how the legislature will interpret it, of how the legislature might put it in place. And if the legislature were to say, as we started the last session, 5% of what you are gaining out of your general academic fund will be performance, will we be willing to accept this metric in that aspect as well as in the aspect that we're trying to define here?
And I think that's a good point. One thing that's certainly different in this approach is that we are going to be making the effort to impress upon the legislature that this is separate from the current model. It's outside the model. We've discussed a phase-in of whatever we do to minimize redistributions, and working with that, I think we don't want them going back to a different approach to this, of pulling out existing money. So we just need to be sensitive to that. But like I said, we'll develop some language and circulate it, and kind of we can get there. I think we'll be okay on that. With respect to the models before us, what's the wishes of the committee here? Do we want to, obviously, number one has been before us from the very beginning, but do we want to continue to work on a variation of the model, which would be either the model with graduate hours or model 2 and 3? Those are the ones I'd consider to be in play here. BJ?
Well, since nobody else is willing to speak up,
Thank you, Robert.
I don't see any reason to go with the Carnegie classification, given that we have the in-state groups and it's not likely to be well received by the legislature. It's like,
okay, is everybody okay with striking those 4 and 5 as options then? Okay.
I agree.
And I would think Perry was pretty adamant about not having graduate degrees in there.
Wasn't clear. I am very opposed
In case, since he didn't speak up on that one, I'm going to just say.
I agree with Perry on that.
I do too.
Okay. Is there anyone that wants to provide a counter argument on that issue? Okay, that would strike
Three.
option 3. And also the option 1 is in the first column, I guess, is no longer an issue. So the second option 1 or option 2 is kind of where we stand. And, between those two models, there's not a lot of variation. There's a number of things we could do to bring them closer together if that was our desire. Beyond that, we still have other issues that we may want to address in terms of the things that Trey talked about. If we want to do something different on at risk, we could certainly look at doing that. But on the mission issue, it comes down to these two.
The draft recommendation doesn't require either of those models, correct? Meaning it doesn't specify one or the other. As I read it, it's open.
Well, I mean, the committee will recommend a specific model.
Okay.
Yeah, it was our hope that you'd recommend a model.
I mean, obviously, the commissioner will make a recommendation, and will probably pick a model for us if we don't, or the legislature will do it on their own, and I don't think we want that.
Yeah, I think we need to pick a model, and I think we need to be able to say that the model addresses mission, and to the extent that it can, it addresses the redistribution.
Do you think that doing a phase-in, which we discussed this time, does that address the redistribution issue?
I think it could. John, I have a quick question, Paul. When we've got these total losses down here at the bottom, does that mean that would be 16.9 million less than the 234 million, or what does that mean exactly?
No, that just mean all I did was sum up the negatives in the column. It really doesn't mean that anyone's going to lose money. In fact, in this scenario, everyone gains money, because if they fund your recommendation and they give you this money on top, it just means that that's that much less had it gone through the INO formula. So those institutions would have received more money had they said, oh, yeah, we'll give you a recommendation and we'll give you $234 million above it. And if they put it through the formula, those institutions, in this case, are getting less money.
Did we ask Paul the last time for the outcomes budgeting part of it to be above and beyond the regular? In other words, just as we're talking about it this time.
You did.
Yet it still failed. You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's even though you're right, if we did get the additional funding, everybody would have more. But yet, as the process unfolded, people opposed it.
Well, my recollection is that the Reform Advisory Committee did recommend that it be outside the formula. But what was presented in the legislature was inside the formula.
Right. The commissioner and the board's recommendation went forward with it inside of the model.
All I'm saying is, the more losses and gains there are, the greater likelihood that model will fail, for the same reasons it failed the last time. And if you just look at it, there are greater losses in 3 than in 2, in terms of the magnitude of the losses and the magnitude of the gains.
I thought option 3 was off the table.
Option 2 compared with option B, 1B, the second column.
What I'm saying is, if they didn't pass column 2, why are they going to pass column 3?
Well, actually, option 2, the way it's presented here, it doesn't have the phase-in in it. So those losses would be limited to 0.5%, and the gains would be limited, and so it wouldn't be exactly as displayed.
Yes, I understand that, but probably could have been a phase-in last time.
Sure.
So Perry, maybe to just comment on what you're saying is, I don't know that the legislature said we don't like the outcomes based. They just didn't address it. I think what we're trying to address is the commissioner saying members that weren't around this table last year said you should have done a better job or you should have done something different. Is that, I mean, because I don't think the legislature really said this is bad.
The comments we heard, let's go with the comments we heard, were that it didn't address mission, or they were unclear how it addressed the mission. And that was the biggest one, because I think the commissioner agreed that it could be outside the formula. That was not an issue. And that it didn't, moving forward, institutions did not compete against themselves. And those were the two complaints that we heard during the session. Mainly that it didn't take into account mission, and the that moving forward, institutions did not compete against themselves. It was everybody competed against each other. Then
we're reconstructing history. All we have is the outcome, and my feeling on it was, however it was expressed, it was the feeling that there were losers and winners. And I remember when we concluded this the last time, at the last meeting, and I can't remember who said it, but it looked like the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That was what was said in this meeting at the very last time we met. And then we voted for it. But in any case, does the option 2, how can we have option 2 when the accountability groups have not yet gotten together and decided on how to weight?
Option 2 is strictly here's an option, then that would be the next step. If y'all had no interest in it, there was not really a big reason to come in and have everybody come in.
Thanks.
But you did propose.
We proposed that
waiting.
We proposed a waiting, and that was Paul looking at it going, okay.
Yeah, the intent is both for the scaling and the weighting, that this group will continue to look at that. This isn't the final version. This is just a mock-up so that you can have something to talk about.
So basically, we're saying that if we went with option 2, that we would go with option 2 because it accounts for mission to some extent.
It accounts for mission, and it has the scaling. And thank you for reminding me, one of the scaling issues was that 1 point, even though it was weighted as 1, the numbers were so small that it was not proportionately accounted for in the thing. And so that's why the scaling. And so that was one of the factors that we heard, that there was not a proportionate scaling across all the different metrics. So even though at risk, you had fewer at-risk students, and so it didn't really count for as much as the other things and all of that.
I guess if we're looking for something to sort by mission, then although it might be a bit more complicated, I go back to believing we should see what Trey's model with inputs looks like, because I think that is getting closer to what it is that the differences in mission might be. It may be mission by another name, but the reality is it is indeed then truly accounting for the important factors that might be driving the models. It seems to me it's going to come closer to that than the accountability group.
Are you suggesting we do that instead of the scaling and weighting?
Since we have another meeting, I believe, I suggest we have the opportunity to at least review it. And then the second piece of that I would ask about is, it seems to me that we've punted now for 2 sessions on what we mean by at risk, and we have a definition in there, but the the critical fields, and the critical fields definition, it seems to me that it's, unless something has changed with regard to the scaling, it seems to me that it's still based on critical fields from a number of years ago. And I thought what we had talked about doing before was accounting for some of the significant changes that have taken place in some other disciplines and making sure that we could incorporate. Have we been able to do that?
And that gets us back to HB 1296, which says that we're going to be doing a study, and we're getting help on where we're looking at the Texas Workforce Commission data and the degrees being produced and where the need will be around the state. And we have to look at it both statewide and regionally and come up with a model that will help us update that. And we have actually hired RAND, and they're going out and they're going to be talking to industry people around the state to get us started on that.
I think that's very
that
positive.
Can feed into it, but
we won't have that for decisions here, but it will be able to be, the model would be able to be updated based on that information. Okay. That's very helpful. I expect if we looked at this that, I don't know, things like accounting might start to show up as a critical field by some other kinds of definitions, because there's a need for an awful lot of accountants, it seems like, and who knows what we're going to need.
I said more and more as the government grows.
Yeah, all right, precisely. So I'm glad to hear that that's happening.
Any other comments? Okay, Paul, why don't you explain to the group that if we were to go with option 2, or at least want to explore that further, how page 10 would factor into that? What would be the next step then?
So the next step in exploring option number 2, I think you have to deal with the scaling and the weights together. If you change one and you don't change the other, then you could wind up having a disproportionate effect to it. So a group needs to get together and figure out what they want to do with the weights for the different groups and what they think the scales on each of the metric need to be. Obviously, 0.4 is not real popular. I could see that. Y'all voted with your faces when I mentioned it. So at risk at 0.4 isn't the right scale for that. And 50 for the one that Tennessee chose might not be the right scale for that. I left all the others at 1 because that's what Tennessee had, but as Perry pointed out, that's not necessarily correct, especially as you change these different weights. So the top chart on page 10 there, where we have all the percentages, the idea is a group would get together, and the way I wrote it in is that no weight would be more than 30%, and that they would sum up to be 100%, with no more than, I think, 1 or 2 being 0 for each of the groups.
Imagine them getting together according to groups.
I would think that would be way too many people for some of those groups to have anything productive coming out of it. I would suggest, because there is representation from each group on this committee, that we would maybe have subgroups of this and then propose and send it out for comment and get comments back. Because a committee of 50 rarely gets anything done.
Paul, can you describe or clarify the table a little bit? I keep trying to figure out how it adds up to 100%.
Okay, so I got that question when I first sent it around to staff. What I did was I repeated the weight for total undergraduate degrees for the metrics that dealt with total undergraduate degrees. So you can see the cost weighted and the undergraduate degree for critical fields and math and science certificates. I just left those at 20%. It simplified my work when I was trying to do this very quickly. The groups that get together probably will choose a different weighting value for each individual metric. But I got lazy and did it real fast. So it doesn't really add up to 100%, but it needs to. Yeah.
It should. It does.
It should. Yes. Yes. But take, for example, if you took all the ones that I gave a 20% to and you divided them by 4, it's not going to really shift those percentages a whole lot.
Now, if you look at what's happened in some other states that have gone through a process like this, what you'll see is, some of the regional institutions, the master's peer group, I think is master's level institutions, they'll weight more factors like persistence and the progress to degree, whereas because that's part of their mission, it's a metric that they'll do well on relative to the flagships will likely choose number of graduates as the metric that they place the most weight on. So that's what's happened if you look at the way these things have played out in other states and how these get weighted.
So, Paul, is the only limit on the adjustments that they can't exceed 30%, or is there another limit?
The limit that they can't exceed 30%, and that I can't remember whether I put 1 or 2 metrics can't be 0.
I believe that was more for when we included the doctoral, because if you don't have doctoral degrees, 0 is a good point. So we may not want a 0 on any of these without having graduate degrees and stuff.
Okay. Okay, so there's really 2 options before us. Option 1, what we adopted last time, and then any changes we wish to make to that one, which I think the only thing we've really discussed has been whether we make any changes to the at-risk metric. There may be change to the critical fields metric depending on the update. Or option 2, which would then require us to have these weights adjusted by groups and developing a consensus around that. So that's not a decision that has to be made today. If you're prepared to make one, that's fine. But I would hope at the December meeting we'd be ready to, we would come in here knowing which option we're going with and make final recommendations.
Okay, and I'm going to volunteer Paul that if y'all select option 2, he could do some optimizing, looking at the different weights across as the committees are meeting. He's done that before on other things.
Okay. That would certainly expedite things if we.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what I can do is basically, you're welcome, BJ, anything for you. What I can do is basically go through and figure out what creates the least amount of negative redistribution for each accountability group with the weight set in a specific way. So it wouldn't be by institution, it'd be by group.
Are we set on having these different measures involved, or is there any way to pare those down on 2 counts? One is that legislators that I talk to want to keep things simple, we'll put it that way, and the other is if these are intended to drive behavior, I don't think we're going to work on all of those various areas. There are too many. They become just elements. If there were 2 or 3 things that were driving the amounts, we might be able to pay attention to that, but not 6, not 7, not 8. I had to make a suggestion. Like 30 hours, 60 hours, 90 hours, I know those, perhaps the retention metrics apply to different people or more than one than another, but I don't know how you work on each one of those. Math and science teaching certificates, and then critical fields are awfully similar.
They're pretty much the same. They're just broken out here.
Okay.
They're really one metric. The 30, 60, 90 are also a metric.
Together, could they maybe think about making 4 instead of 5, or 3 instead of 7, or whatever?
Leaving them separated out allows the weighting group to be different. Sure. Combining them together eliminates that possibility. So like for the 30, 60, 90, you might not see it as you might not see the 30 hours as high of a weight as maybe the 90 or vice versa. So I don't know. That's up to the committee. I don't want to open an election.
And perhaps in that sense it's worth looking at, but in terms of influencing university behavior, it's probably difficult to include that many or to get it past the legislature.
Retention metrics are pretty common in these models. Are you suggesting we could have just one retention metric?
Yes. Hard to focus on any of them, really.
I guess one of the things is the way that you're defining the progress. It's within the institution, and you begin to get points when a student actually gets 30. Is that correct?
At your institution. Right?
At your institution, so they have to.
So that student might actually have 60 hours, but they only have 30 hours at your institution.
And that's something that could be opened up for discussion.
Because it's defined differently at different, and I mean, I've seen one, how many get to 30 within 1 year, 60
right.
within 2 years. You're not defining it that way.
No. They could take 9 years to get 30 hours, and
they would get there.
Well, 9's not really the right number because we don't look quite that far back, but, Yeah.
But the same would be for a transfer student. A transfer student who would come in, then they would count once they hit the 30. They may never get to the 90, hopefully.
Right. Hopefully they wouldn't. Hopefully they'd graduate.
Right. So that's it's exactly how, because from a traditional standpoint, the graduation rate and the progress to degree sort of are reinforcing the same thing from an FTIC perspective.
Mm-hmm.
From the way you talked about it, sometimes it's some people never graduate, but you want to get credit for taking some, which is another way of looking at it. It's hard to know how that all dynamic, and this is one of the reasons why sometimes, for an institution, looking at these multiple variables, what is it that we're trying to get everybody to focus on to try to improve or recognize as an accomplishment.
I think they, in other places they're called momentum points, and I think there is some research behind that if students reach certain points in their accumulation of credit hours, they're more than likely to continue and complete the degree. So it's an outcomes-based funding model. It gives the institution credit for movement of students, and it's often defined as an event, not where you got it, but it's an event when you accumulate 30, and wherever you are, that institution gets that credit for those 30 hours. So it wouldn't disadvantage an institution with transfer students. If they cross that 30-hour threshold, if we count them here in the community college outcomes-based funding formula, that event would be counted there. But when they move on, then future momentum point accumulation counts for the institution.
And we could run it that way, or say we're going to, where it didn't matter where you accumulated. That would be up to y'all to decide.
I'm confused a little bit, though, then. Suppose you had only transfer students, and they only came with 65 hours. You'd only have one 30-hour option with each one before they graduated. And would that
30 and 60
hurt you then? I mean, you wouldn't get money somewhere because
Yeah,
you're not
actually,
scoring
I
on the
think
other
you
items.
most likely be at a bit of disadvantage, especially if they wound up getting their 60 hours before they transferred. You'd only have one milestone to cross with them. Versus now, you really probably have two.
Right, and that's why I was wondering how it worked. Are we, in effect, getting money for crossing each milestone and you don't cross one, or some universities wouldn't? Or so you're going to have to help me with how the math actually works.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, but it's also true that the student's not receiving, services up until the point he or she enters the institution, so he's not, it's not adding to your cost as an institution up until they transfer, right? So, even though you're not able to receive credit for the momentum point at 60 semester credit hours, you're not providing the, it's not adding to your cost because those costs were at another institution. Right? That's one way to.
Yes, but
True, but you're in discrete.
But you're getting rewarded.
Here, you hit one discrete for one type of university, and we're actually very close to that.
You're getting rewarded for the degree completion, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
there is total undergraduate degrees,
Yes, you're
but
still
they're
getting-
already discounted by the graduation rate, which deals with the transfer student. And then they're further.
Yeah, that's what I wondered earlier.
by
Why do we do this
the
other
retention
stuff?
points.
If we've got degrees, they capture that.
I think they've instituted the retention points to try to give credit before you graduate someone. I mean, if they get so many hours and then they leave.
Time. 4 years is a long time to get nothing for a student. So that's the conversation that went on in the last group to add the 30, 60, 90.
Might as well just pay them for semester credit hours. Then that's a finer gradation than these discrete jumps, is what I'm saying. So we're right back where
Right.
we were. Better to be in the I know. Because you're always, some university will miss some students with a model
Always.
like this. Right. Compared to the other model.
Yeah, and obviously, we are exactly that institution
Right.
that you described, with only transfer students.
And that is something that we could look at, saying, if they hit 30, 60, 90 at your institution, then you would get the credit. I mean, that's another way of looking at it, and we can run that. But
Well, they've got to have 30 before they get to our institution, at least. They could hit 60. Hopefully, they will hit 90.
and then graduate.
Not if they come with, 38 hours.
Well, or if they
Won't get
come
90.
with.
So you only have two, in your case, two options there.
Yeah.
Will we have Trey's model at the next meeting?
I don't know. I have to ask the person that's going to be primarily calculating it. I still have a question about doing Trey's model. We didn't circle back on. What do you want me to run it against? Right now, he recommends, or he at least put in his presentation, we do it off either they had Pell or they didn't have Pell, and 3 different groupings of SAT scores. But I'd need to know, if you didn't want to use SAT and Pell, which 2 student characteristics you would like to use. You want me to just do them all?
No.
No.
It'll be next year sometime.
I'm comfortable with, with the SAT and the Pell.
Okay.
When's the next
Have
meeting?
any of our
weeks.
Texas universities given up on the SAT score, using it at all? And some in the East don't keep that anymore.
Yeah.
Yes? Or not? I just
Y'all don't have it at all, Cynthia?
No, I'm agreeing with what he said.
Oh, okay.
A lot of institutions are moving away from that and placing
You
that
might not
the
have
high
that
priority it used to have.
Yeah, that's
a lot.
Well, and given that virtually, not all, but virtually all of our students come from community colleges,
Yeah.
they may
you
not
won't-
have it either.
You may not have it at all.
So if you run that, will you run it as a variation of Model 1?
Maybe it'd be a good idea if we run it just to keep it as a standalone, and I can show the percent distribution of that and the percent distribution of the current at risk, and you compare the two and decide whether you wanted to substitute or add that to the version. Completely up to.
Because you're right, for the upper level institutions, we will probably have very few SAT scores, SAT, ACT scores.
And I guess we're going to
For
have to
transfer
exclude
students.
the portion of the cohort that doesn't have a score.
Don't know.
We certainly
the
can't
only
just
piece
assume-
that you have in the community college transfer, or the transfer in period, would be the GPA. I suppose that's the.
We don't have that. Y'all have that. We don't have that.
That's the main reason I didn't include high school GPA.
Not high school GPA, but college
GPA.
GPA. For the transfer student, in order to deal with the
Yeah, I mean, you could differentiate between the transfer students and the first-time students and calculate it with separate bins that way, right? For the two separate groups of students.
30 hours at a community college.
Wouldn't we have their SAT score for the college board?
When we run the calculations for graduation rates, we do a different set for the transfers than we do for the FDICs.
Right.
We tend to use SAT and Pell, but we can't use that for the
for the transfer students.
And I mean that's one of the things in this whole thing. You talk about optimizing it by group, but it will be hard for the groups to suddenly look at across all of these indicators, exactly what combination or what weighting of them really does match the type of institution, their mission and their student characteristics and their at-risk students. I mean, those, that's something I don't think the conversation hasn't gone there yet. So exactly, there's something of a sense that, is this set of metrics more weighted towards a traditional, student, or is it have the potential? We know that there are things in there that dealing with the non-traditional student that,
that would be the, I don't know what that was. That would be the undergraduates per 100 FTE.
Yes, that piece in there, that's what everybody clings to. But I mean, how many other variables are there like that? And that's, I guess, the question of, are we balancing out something that has a balance of metrics, so an institution that is really predominantly transfer and a transfer institution, as many of our institutions really are. How does that, and becoming more so because most of the students are coming into higher ed through the community college.
I mean, you could have the argument that based on kind of this conversation whether the institution primarily, has its students as transfer students versus regular first-time, full-time enrolled students could be part of the kind of mission factor or part of the mission grouping. And these types of metrics where, the at-risk student characteristic weighted graduates would be calculated in a different way for institutions whose primary mission is, the transfer students. It would be based on, the GPA at the prior institution or GPA coming into the institution or something like that, as opposed to the SAT at the other institutions. And then if there's a large group of institutions that are no longer using SAT or proposing to do that, then that they may be concentrated in one of the kind of mission groups. But there's a lot there, but
I mean, if it's that big of an issue, it seems like the most straightforward way to do it is simply have a metric for undergraduate degrees of a transfer student, and you can always weight it to make sure it's taken into account the correct way. So, I mean, we can certainly have Paul look at that and just see if it simplifies things.
Am I correct that the only way the transfer student now is that is a good thing is total undergraduate degrees?
And the 100.
Yeah, and the 100, that between those two.
Right.
Okay.
And whatever you got retention.
Yeah, for the upper level institutions, we use, instead of just their adjusted 6-year graduation rate, we use a transfer graduation rate. So the number of students who enter that graduate within 4 years, to try and account for that for those upper levels. Because we know you have no first-time entering.
Does that translate to what we're
pretty
trying
close
to
to
do?
the average for most institutions for the statewide. If you look at statewide average and you look at the transfer graduation rate for most transfer students, about the same as for the first-time entering. But I'd have to look at your institution, see what it See what it does, Mark.
Okay, Paul, my recollection is you polled the members on a January meeting.
Yes.
Did you get a date?
Yes. Let's see. There's 2 dates in January that I've put out there, January 6th and January 24th. I think one person has declined the January 6th meeting, but I haven't gotten responses from everybody on those meetings yet.
So the 6th looks good for everybody except one member?
Well, only one person has declined.
Oh, I see.
Responded
Okay.
with a decline, but I don't have a representative response yet from everybody.
Okay, then I'd ask the committee members to respond to that. I don't know that we will have to have the January meeting, but it looks like we've got some additional work to do. And we don't have a lot of time between now and the December meeting to work through all this. It sounds like what, Paul, you can correct me, what you need to be doing between now and the next meeting is, with respect to metrics, they want to look at what Trey has proposed. We'll look at a separate metric on transfer student undergraduate degrees, I guess, in effect. And then for option 2, you will send out sort of an initial proposal on adjusted weights for each accountability group that we will circulate and hopefully get some input back. Is there anything else that I've missed?
The only thing is, I think, put together a draft report, send that out to everybody for markups.
Yeah, I was just on charge 1 is all I was focused on right now, but yes, that's part of it as well. Okay, is there anything else that we're missing here that we discussed today? Okay, whatever Paul sends out, be aware that he needs a quick response because the next meeting is December 6th, I believe. Is that right?
December 4th.
Okay, even less time. So please respond. Again, on charges 2 and 3, it'll be a response on, are you okay with the language that he sends out? If there's any edits to that language, get it back to him. And then on charge 1, there'll be a number of things coming to you. Look through that, provide feedback back to him, and hopefully we'll be able to come in here on the 4th and reach a consensus on what we want to recommend on charge 1.
I would request, with the analysis related to your recommendation, as much as possible, real clear description of what's happening in that model, because I want to fully understand it. Would be very, very helpful. I don't think there's time today to go into the details that would make me more comfortable with it, so that would be very helpful.
Trey has offered a paper testimony along with his presentation today. You have a copy of it there. It further describes the model.
Yeah, it describes the logic of the model. It's about 2 pages description of that particular metric.
That was sent out this morning?
It's in the appendix of that paper.
I haven't seen it.
Sure. And if you have further questions or if that's not sufficiently clear, I'm happy to add more.
All right, then, any other business before the committee today? If not, then we'll adjourn the committee and be back on December 4th. Thank you.